The door of the house she had always known, closed with a sound as final as a coffin lid. It was not a slam, but a quiet, oiled click that spoke of wealth and permanence, a permanence from which Elspeth was now forever severed. Her stepmother, Miriam, did not look at her through the window. She simply turned away, a dark shape dissolving into the warm lamplight of the parlor. In Elspeth's hand were 20 silver dollars, cold and heavy. In her pocket was a deed, folded until the paper was soft as cloth, for a piece of land her father had won in a card game and kept as a family joke. The Widow's Hole, they called it, a worthless limestone cliff face 10 miles north of Providence Gulch, notable only for the dark, uninviting cave that scarred its surface. At 20 years old, Elspeth was an orphan twice over. First by the fever that took her father, the best dairyman in the county, and now by the cool, legal cruelty of the woman who had replaced her mother. Miriam and her 2 hulking sons had waited a respectable 3 months before the family lawyer explained the new reality. The dairy, the house, the herds, it was all theirs now. Elspeth was given a choice: marry a man 3 times her age to secure a respectable alliance for the family, or take her meager inheritance and be gone by sundown. The $20 was a gesture of Christian charity, the lawyer had said. The deed was a final, bitter joke. She stood on the porch, the chill of the evening air seeping through her thin wool shawl. The town of Providence Gulch was settling down for the night, its windows glowing like scattered embers. She had nothing but the clothes on her back, the coins, the useless paper, and Boulder, her father's old dog, who pressed his great, shaggy head against her leg, whining softly. He was the only piece of her old life they had allowed her to keep. They said he was too old to be a proper working dog anymore. Like her, he was now deemed surplus. She walked not to the livery for a ticket east, but to the mercantile. The bell above the door chimed, a sound that had always meant candy and comfort. Tonight, it sounded like an alarm. Mr. Gable, the proprietor, was polishing the counter with a cloth. He was a man whose opinions were as neatly stacked and priced as the goods on his shelves. He saw her, and his face settled into a mask of practiced pity. "Elspeth," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A sad day. A terrible injustice." He glanced at the small, worn satchel in her hand. "Headed for the stagecoach, I imagine? Best to get a fresh start somewhere new." "I need some things," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Her throat felt tight, as if packed with dust. She ignored his advice. It felt like every other piece of charity she had been offered that day. A soft stone to weigh her down. She laid her coins on the counter, a small, gleaming pile. A good axe, a small saw, a sack of flour, one of salt, and a box of matches. She paused, calculating. And a length of rope. Mr. Gable stopped polishing. He looked at the coins, then at her, his eyebrows rising. "That's a strange list for a girl traveling. That's a list for someone staying." He leaned forward, his voice dropping conspiratorially. "Listen, child. I knew your father. He was a good man, but he was sentimental. That land he left you, it's a joke. It's a hole in a rock. Nothing grows there. You can't build on it. Sell the deed to me for $1. It'll buy you a hot meal in the next town." "The land is mine," she said. The words tasted foreign, but she spoke them with a certainty that surprised even herself. "I'll take the axe, Mr. Gable, the one with the hickory handle." He sighed, the sound of a man witnessing a fool's final act. He gathered her supplies, his movements slow and deliberate, as if to give her time to change her mind. He wrapped the axe head in burlap. As he pushed the heavy sack of flour toward her, he gave one last piece of advice. "The winters in the high country are not kind, Elspeth. That rock will be your tomb." She shouldered the sack, the weight a shock to her system. She looped the rope over her other shoulder, the axe held tight in her hand. Boulder stayed close to her heel, a silent, furry shadow. She did not look back at Mr. Gable's pitying face. She did not look back at the warm lights of the town that had been her home. She turned her face to the north, toward the rising moon and the cold, dark mountains, and began to walk. The journey was a punishment. 10 miles on a flat road was a morning's stroll. 10 miles into the rugged high country, with a 50-pound sack of flour digging into her spine, and an axe threatening to unbalance her with every step, was a pilgrimage through a kind of hell. The manicured fields and pastures of Providence Gulch gave way to scrubland, then to thick pine forest, where the trail became a faint suggestion between looming, ancient trees. The air grew thinner, colder. The sounds of the valley, the distant lowing of cattle, the bark of a farm dog, faded, replaced by the sigh of the wind through the pines and the lonely call of a night bird. Boulder stayed beside her, his presence a small, warm comfort in the vast, indifferent wilderness. He did not stray, did not chase the scent of rabbits or deer. He seemed to understand that their world had shrunk to this narrow path, to the space she occupied. By the time the sun began to lighten the eastern sky, her muscles were screaming a silent, fiery protest. Her hands, soft from a life of domestic work, were raw and blistered from the rough handle of the axe. She saw it just after dawn, a great gray wall of limestone rising from the earth, stark and sheer against the deep blue of the mountain sky. And there, halfway up its face, was a dark opening, like a wound in the stone. The widow's hole. It was worse than she had imagined. It was not a gentle cave. It was a jagged mouth surrounded by loose scree and stunted, wind-twisted junipers. It looked desolate, forgotten by God. She dropped her supplies, the sack of flour hitting the ground with a heavy, final thud. Her knees buckled, and she sank down onto the cold, rocky ground, the strength leaving her body in a single, shuddering wave. Mr. Gable's words echoed in her mind, "That rock will be your tomb." For a long, terrifying moment, she believed him. The sheer, brutal reality of her situation washed over her. The town was right. Her stepmother was right. She was a fool, a girl playing at survival, with a handful of tools and a worthless piece of rock. Tears of exhaustion and despair stung her eyes, hot and shameful in the cold morning air. Boulder whined and licked her face, his tongue rough against her skin, but the comfort couldn't penetrate the thick wall of her hopelessness. She sat there for an hour as the sun climbed higher, feeling the cold of the ground seep into her bones. The thought of returning to town, of begging for charity, or accepting the humiliating marriage proposal, was a bitter poison in her throat. But what was the alternative? To lie down here and let the wilderness claim her? She pushed herself to her feet, her body aching with a profound weariness. She had to see it. She had to stand inside her inheritance, her tomb, and know for certain that it was hopeless before she gave up. She scrambled up the loose rock of the scree slope, her boots slipping, her raw hands grabbing at sharp edges of stone. Boulder followed, his claws finding purchase where her boots could not. The air at the mouth of the cave was cold, carrying a scent of damp earth and stone dust. She stepped inside, out of the wind, and then she felt it. It was not a blast of frigid air, as she had expected. The coldness was gone. The air inside the cave was still, and while it was cool, it was a living coolness, not the dead, biting cold of the mountain morning. It was a cellar cool, a constant, steady temperature that felt preserved. She took another step into the darkness, her eyes slowly adjusting. The cave was not a simple hole. It opened up into a large, vaulted chamber, the ceiling disappearing into shadows high above. The walls were smooth, sculpted by millennia of water she could not see. She heard a sound, a soft, rhythmic dripping. Following the sound, she moved deeper into the cave, her hand trailing along the cool, damp limestone wall. In a small alcove at the back of the chamber, she found it. A tiny, perfect stream of water, clear as glass, was seeping directly from a fissure in the rock, dripping steadily into a natural stone basin that had been worn smooth over centuries. It was clean, fresh water. A year-round spring, protected from the freeze, sheltered from contamination. She knelt and cupped her hands, drinking deeply. The water was icy cold and tasted of stone and life. As she drank, she placed her other hand flat against the rock wall beside the seep. It was cool, but it felt alive, humming with a deep, ancient energy. This was the secret. The massive limestone cliff was a giant thermal battery. It soaked up the heat of the summer sun and held it deep within, bleeding it out slowly through the winter. It resisted the brutal cold of the night and the searing heat of the day, maintaining a near-constant temperature inside. Her father had been a dairyman. He had taught her the craft. He always said the secret to good cheese and sweet butter was a consistent, cool temperature. A spring house, dug deep into the earth, was the heart of any good dairy. He had spent a fortune building one, with thick stone walls and a water channel to keep the air cool. She was standing inside a natural spring house, a perfect one. A grim resolve, cold and hard as the stone around her, settled into Elspeth's heart. The despair vanished, burned away by a flicker of furious hope. The town saw a worthless hole. Her father, in his drunken card game, had accidentally won her a fortress. Mr. Gable had called it her tomb. She would make it her home. She would make it her creamery. The first week was a blur of brutal, mind-numbing labor. Her body, unaccustomed to such relentless punishment, screamed in protest. Every morning she woke in her makeshift bed of pine boughs, with muscles so stiff she could barely move. Her hands, which had been blistered, were now a mass of calluses and broken skin that bled and burned with every task. But she did not stop. Her first priority was a wall. The cave offered 3 walls and a roof, a gift from the earth itself. But the wide, open mouth was a gaping vulnerability to the wind and to predators. She used the axe, its hickory handle now feeling like a natural extension of her arm, to fell dead, dry pines from the forest below the cliff. She was clumsy at first, the axe glancing off the wood, but she learned the rhythm, the bite of the steel into the grain. Getting the logs up the scree slope was the hardest part. She used her rope, looping it around one end of a log and hauling it up the slope, her boots digging for purchase, her back and legs straining until they trembled. Boulder, seeming to understand, would often brace himself beside her, a furry anchor of encouragement. She laid the first logs across the mouth of the cave, leaving a narrow space for a door and a smaller one for a window. The stones came next. She gathered them from the scree field, choosing flat, stable pieces she could lift. It was back-breaking work. She carried them one by one, her arms aching, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She stacked them between the logs, creating a solid, thick barrier. For mortar, she found a deposit of rich clay near the spring's overflow. She mixed it with water and dry moss, creating a thick, sticky plaster. She packed it into every gap and crevice of her wall, her fingers raw and caked with mud, sealing her home against the wind. The final piece was the door itself, a rough but solid thing she fashioned from split logs and held together with wooden pegs she painstakingly carved. Her second task was fire. A fire in the open cave would fill it with smoke. As she explored deeper, she found what she had hoped for. A narrow fissure in the ceiling, snaking its way up through the rock. It was a natural chimney. Directly beneath it, she built her hearth. She used the flattest, largest stones to create a raised platform, and more clay to build a fireback against the limestone wall. When she finally struck a match and set a small pile of tinder ablaze, the smoke hesitated for a moment, curling in the still air, then found the draft. It rose in a thin, straight line and disappeared into the fissure above. It worked. That night, for the first time, she slept not just out of the wind, but in a pocket of genuine warmth, the firelight dancing on the stone walls of her new home. The heat sank into the limestone, and long after the flames died to embers, the rock itself radiated a gentle, comforting warmth. With the shelter secured, she turned to her systems. The water source was a miracle, but the stone basin was inefficient. Using her axe head and a harder piece of granite as a hammer, she painstakingly chipped a narrow channel from the basin, directing the steady trickle of water into a deeper pit she dug in the clay floor. She lined the pit with more clay, packing it down until it was watertight, creating a small cistern that held a constant supply of fresh, cold water. Now she had water not just for drinking, but for washing, for cooking, and for her future creamery. Food was a constant, pressing need. She set snares along the rabbit trails she found in the woods, and her first catch felt like a feast. The meat roasted over her fire, filling the cave with a rich, savory smell. But she knew she couldn't rely on trapping alone. In the deepest, darkest part of the cave, where no sunlight ever reached, she began her garden. She hauled buckets of rich, dark soil from the forest floor up the slope, a task that took her days. She spread the soil in shallow beds she marked out with stones. Here she planted the only things that might grow. Mushroom spores she carefully harvested from fallen logs, and the pale, hardy tubers of a wild root her father had told her was edible. It was a strange, subterranean farm, a garden of darkness, but it was a start. After a month of this relentless work, she took stock. She had a home, a rough, primitive shelter, but one that was warm, dry, and secure. She had water and the beginnings of a food supply. But she was desperately lonely, and her dream of a creamery was impossible without an animal. She had a few coins left from the original $20, and a small, secret pouch her father had given her years ago, containing 10 gold coins he had told her to save for a true emergency. This, she decided, was that emergency. Her return to Providence Gulch was a spectacle. She walked into town not as a broken refugee, but as a creature of the wilderness. Her clothes were stained with dirt and pine pitch. Her face was tanned by the wind, and her hands were the rough, calloused hands of a laborer. She walked with a new confidence, her back straight, her stride sure. People stopped and stared. Whispers followed her down the main street like dry leaves skittering in the wind. She went directly to the mercantile. Mr. Gable was measuring out beans for a customer. He looked up, and his jaw dropped slightly. He saw the change in her. He saw the strength in her shoulders and the clear, steady look in her eyes. But his surprise quickly soured into derision. "Well, look what the mountain coughed up," he said, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Come back for a proper roof over your head, have you? I told you that hole was no place for a civilized person." "I've come to buy a goat," Elspeth said, her voice cutting through the snickers of the other customers. "A good milking nanny, and a half-dozen laying hens." The store fell silent. Mr. Gable stared at her, as if she had grown a second head. "A goat? For what? To keep you company in your tomb? What are you going to feed it? Rocks?" "That's my business," she said, pulling out her father's secret pouch and laying a single gold coin on the counter. The sight of gold silenced him completely. It was more than enough. He led her out to the livestock pens behind the store without another word, his face a mixture of confusion and resentment. She chose her animal carefully, a hardy nanny goat with a calm demeanor and a healthy look. She bought the chickens, a small coop, and bags of feed, spending nearly all the rest of her money. The journey back was even more difficult than the first. She had to lead the stubborn goat, carry the clucking, protesting chickens in a crate, and haul the heavy bags of feed. It took her 2 full days. Back at the cave, she partitioned off a section near the entrance for her small flock, building a sturdy pen. The goat, which she named Clover, immediately began exploring her new home, her cloven hooves clicking on the stone floor. That evening, as the fire crackled and the animals settled in their new home, Elspeth milked Clover for the first time. The stream of warm, white milk into the wooden bucket was the sound of a promise fulfilled. She drank a cup of it, rich and sweet. It tasted like victory. She had a home, she had a fire, she had water, and now she had milk. She had the beginning of a life. The town could mock her all they wanted. They could call her the cave girl. She was still here. The gossip that drifted up from Providence Gulch was as persistent and irritating as a summer fly. Trappers and hunters who passed through the high country would sometimes stop, stare at the smoke rising from the invisible chimney in the cliff face, and report back to Mr. Gable. The story of the cave girl and her goat became a local legend, a cautionary tale told to frighten children and amuse men in the tavern. They gave her folly a name. The widow's whole creamery, said with a sneer and a wink. Mr. Gable himself made the trip once, under the pretense of checking on a far-flung trapping line. He found her splitting firewood in the clearing below her cave. He did not offer to help. He stood at a distance, hands on his hips, and surveyed her work. He saw the sturdy wall, the tidy woodpile, the small enclosure where the chickens scratched in the dirt. "A great deal of work for a lost cause," he pronounced, his voice echoing slightly against the rock face. "Winter is coming, Elspeth. A real winter. This little fort of yours will be buried. You and that goat will freeze solid. There's still time to come to your senses. I'll still give you $1 for the deed." "I'm not selling," she said, not pausing in her work. The axe rose and fell in a steady, powerful rhythm. "And my goat is quite warm, thank you." He shook his head, a theatrical display of pity. "Stubbornness is a poor substitute for a roof, child." He turned and left, and she knew he would return to town with a fresh report of her foolishness, embellished for dramatic effect. She did not care. His words were just noise, like the wind. The proof of her life was in the solid thud of the axe, the warmth of the fire, and the pail of milk she collected every morning and every evening. As autumn deepened, turning the aspens to rivers of gold in the valley below, Elspeth settled into a deep, solitary routine. Her world shrank to the rhythms of survival: the sun, the fire, the animals. Her days were a litany of simple, essential tasks. Wake before dawn, stoke the embers of the fire back to life, milk Clover, feed the chickens and collect their precious eggs, haul water from the cistern, check her snares, chop and stack firewood, always adding to the enormous pile that now stood against the inside wall of the cave, tend her strange, dark garden of mushrooms and roots. In the afternoons, she worked on her creamery. She used her father's old butter churn, a simple wooden plunger in a tall crock, to turn the rich goat's milk into sweet, pale butter. She packed it in small clay pots and stored them in the coldest part of the cave. She began making cheese, simple, soft cheeses at first, which she salted and left to ripen on wooden shelves she had built into an alcove in the rock. The cave was the perfect aging room, its constant cool temperature and humidity doing the work for her. The cave was no longer just a shelter. It was a living pantry, a workshop, a barn. It was a complete, self-sustaining world of her own making. Her only companion in this silent world was Boulder. The old dog was her shadow, her guard, and her confidant. He lay before the fire while she worked, his head on his paws, watching her with intelligent, patient eyes. At night, he slept at the foot of her bed, a warm, breathing weight in the darkness. His low growl was her only alarm, a warning of any creature that strayed too close to their home. The isolation was profound. Weeks would go by without her seeing another human soul. At times, a wave of loneliness would wash over her, so sharp and painful it almost brought her to her knees. She missed the sound of conversation, the bustle of the town, the simple feeling of being part of a community, even one that had cast her out. But then she would look at what she had built. She would feel the solid rock at her back, taste the sweet butter she had churned with her own hands, and the loneliness would recede, replaced by a quiet, fierce pride. She was not just surviving, she was thriving on her own terms. The first test came in late October. A pack of wolves, their coats thick for the coming winter, were drawn by the scent of her small livestock. She was awakened in the dead of night by Boulder's frantic, savage barking. She grabbed the axe and peered through a small crack in her door. In the moonlight she saw them, 4 gaunt, gray shapes circling the base of the cliff, their eyes glowing like yellow coals. They tested the walls of the chicken coop, clawing at the wood. Clover bleated in terror from her pen inside the cave. Elspeth's heart hammered against her ribs, but her door, made of thick, pegged logs, held firm. The wolves could find no purchase on the rock, no way into her fortress. For hours, Boulder barked himself hoarse, a furious guardian at the gate. Finally, as the sky began to lighten, the wolves gave up and melted back into the forest. Her systems had held. The second test was a storm, an early blizzard that swept down from the high peaks in mid-November. It was not the great storm, but a preview, a warning of what was to come. For 3 days, the world outside her cave disappeared into a swirling vortex of white. The wind howled like a hungry beast, battering her small section of exposed wall. Snow piled up against her door until she was completely sealed in. But inside, it was calm. The fire in her hearth drew perfectly, the natural chimney impervious to the wind. The limestone walls absorbed the cold, and the interior of the cave remained a steady, comfortable temperature. She had her animals, her food stores, her water. She simply waited it out. When the storm finally broke and she dug her way out into a world of blinding white and deep blue, she felt a surge of confidence. Let the winter come. She was ready. It began in the final days of December, a cold so deep and profound it felt like the earth's heart had stopped beating. The settlers in Providence Gulch called it the Great Freeze of '83. The temperature dropped far below zero and stayed there, day after relentless day. The very air seemed to crystallize, and a breath drawn too quickly felt like swallowing needles. Trees, frozen solid, exploded in the forest with a sound like rifle shots. The river that powered the town's small grist mill froze solid, bank to bank. Then the snow came. It was not a gentle winter fall, but an assault. It fell without pause for a week, a thick, blinding curtain of white that erased the world. The wind rose with it, a screaming, endless gale that picked up the snow and hurled it like sand, scouring the landscape, piling it into drifts 20 feet high. It was a storm for the ages, a blizzard that would be spoken of for generations. It was a physical entity, a monster that clawed at roofs, smashed windows, and sought out every crack and crevice with its icy breath. In Providence Gulch, it was a catastrophe. The town's confidence, built on sturdy log cabins and the assumption that they had tamed this land, shattered like frozen glass. The conventional structures, built to withstand ordinary winters, were no match for this. The wind tore shingles from roofs and drove snow through the chinking in the walls. chimneys, clogged with ice and snow, refused to draw, filling homes with choking smoke or forcing families to let their fires die out. Mr. Gable's Mercantile, the proudest building in town, suffered the worst. The weight of the snow on its flat roof was too much. With a groan of tortured timber, the main beam cracked, and a portion of the roof collapsed, burying half his stock under a mountain of snow and splintered wood. Families huddled together in their freezing homes, burning furniture to stay alive as their woodpiles, buried under insurmountable drifts, became unreachable. The town's well, their only source of water, froze to a depth of 6 feet. The livestock in the barns, unaccustomed to such prolonged, extreme cold, began to die. The community's preparations, their collective wisdom, had failed completely. They were isolated, freezing, and beginning to starve. 10 miles north, inside her cliff, Elspeth was in another world. The great storm was a distant rumor, a muffled symphony of rage she could hear but not feel. The wind shrieked and battered the outside of her small wall, but inside, the air was still and calm. The massive thermal battery of the limestone absorbed the brutal cold, and the temperature in her cave barely dropped. Her fire burned steadily, the smoke drawing perfectly up the sheltered fissure in the rock. Her animals were safe and warm in their stone-walled pens. Clover chewed her cud contentedly, and the chickens clucked softly, nestled in their straw. Her cistern, fed by the earth's deep warmth, provided a constant supply of liquid water. Her pantry was full. Shelves of cheese, pots of butter, sacks of flour, and dried meat from her snares. Her subterranean garden provided a small but vital supply of fresh roots. She was not fighting the storm. She was living outside its reach, in a pocket of stillness and warmth she had carved from the rock itself. She listened to the fury of the world outside and felt not fear, but a deep, profound sense of security. Her folly, her tomb, was the safest place in the entire county. On the 8th day of the blizzard, the sound came. It was not the wind. It was a frantic, desperate banging on her door. Boulder erupted in a frenzy of barking, his fur bristling. Elspeth's heart leaped into her throat. No one could be out in this. It was impossible. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth and peered through the small peephole she had drilled in the door. A figure, completely encrusted in snow and ice, was slumped against the wood, little more than a frozen mound. It was a woman. As Elspeth watched, the figure slid down the door and collapsed into the snowdrift. The moral choice was not a choice at all. It was an instinct. You do not leave a soul to die on your doorstep. She heaved against the snow that had piled up against the door, finally managing to open it a crack. She squeezed through and dug frantically at the snow around the fallen figure. She dragged the frozen body inside, the blast of Arctic air that followed it into the cave feeling like a physical blow. She kicked the door shut and barred it, her shelter once again sealed. She brushed the snow from the woman's face. It was Mr. Gable's wife, Mary. Her face was a mask of blue-white skin and ice-caked eyelashes. In her arms, wrapped in a bundle of frozen blankets, was her small son, Thomas. The boy was terrifyingly still, his breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. Memories flashed through Elspeth's mind. Mary Gable turning away from her in the street, whispering with her friends, her laughter carrying on the wind as Elspeth had led her goat out of town. The bitterness rose in her throat, hot and quick. They had scorned her, mocked her, and left her for dead. Now they came to her for salvation. She looked at her carefully rationed firewood, her precious stores of food and milk. Helping them would put her own survival at risk. Then she looked at the child. His small face was pinched and pale. A terrible, rattling cough shook his tiny frame. He was not a mocker. He was just a child, dying of the cold. The bitterness vanished, replaced by the simple, undeniable weight of a human life. She had built this shelter to save herself. Now, she would use it to save them. She worked quickly. She stripped the frozen, wet clothes from Mary and the boy, wrapping them in the warmest wool blankets she owned, and moving them close to the fire. Mary was barely conscious, muttering deliriously, her body racked with shivers. The boy's condition was worse. His fever was high, his breathing labored. It was the lung fever, made deadly by the cold. Elspeth went to a small chest where she kept dried herbs, another piece of knowledge passed down from her father, who had known as much about animal husbandry as he did about folk remedies. She crushed dried mullein leaf and steeped it in hot water, creating a tea to ease the boy's breathing. She made a poultice of mustard seed and flour, wrapped it in a cloth, and laid it on his small chest to break the congestion. She warmed goat's milk with a little honey and patiently coaxed a few spoonfuls between the boy's blue lips. She fed Mary hot broth, spoon by spoon, until some color returned to her cheeks. For 2 days and 2 nights she did not sleep. She tended the fire, administered the remedies, and kept a vigil over the mother and child. She used her resources without a second thought. Her carefully built world, now a hospital, for the family of the man who had despised her most. On the 3rd day, the boy's fever broke. His breathing eased, and he slept a deep, natural sleep. Mary, her strength returning, watched Elspeth with eyes full of a dawning, shattering comprehension. She looked around the cave. She saw the impossible reality of it. The warmth radiating from the stone walls, the neat, ordered shelves holding dozens of wheels of cheese and pots of butter, the healthy animals in their clean pens, the small, miraculous garden of green things growing in the dim light. She saw the ingenious water system, the sturdy construction, the evidence of relentless, intelligent work. This was not the hovel of a mad girl. This was a fortress of ingenuity. It was a sanctuary. Mary's voice was a hoarse whisper. We called you the cave girl. We laughed. My husband, he said you were a fool. Her eyes filled with tears of shame. My God, we were the fools. When the blizzard finally broke, the world was silent, buried under a deep and perfect blanket of white. The first person to make it through the drifts from the devastated town was Mr. Gable. He led a small party of men, their faces gaunt and gray with exhaustion and despair. He was not looking for survivors of the storm. He was looking for the bodies of his wife and son, having convinced himself they had tried to flee the collapsing store and perished in the snow. He saw the thin plume of smoke rising from the cliff face and followed it, his heart a cold, dead knot of dread. He expected to find a frozen tomb. Instead, he found Elspeth outside, clearing a path, her movements strong and steady. He saw her, and he stopped, his breath catching in his throat. Elspeth looked up and met his eyes. She said nothing. She simply stepped aside and gestured toward the open door of her cave. Mr. Gable stepped inside. The warmth hit him first, a thick, living warmth that felt like a miracle. Then his eyes adjusted to the firelight, and he saw them. His wife, pale but alive, sitting by the fire, and his son, sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle, his breathing easy and clear. He stumbled forward, falling to his knees beside them, touching them as if to be sure they were real. He looked up at Elspeth, his face, the face of a proud, judgmental man, completely broken by shame and gratitude. All the mockery, all the condescension, all the certainty he had worn like a fine coat was stripped away, leaving only the raw, humbled core of a man who had been saved by the very person he had condemned. "We were wrong," he said, his voice choking. "Elspeth, we were so wrong." Elspeth did not say, "I told you so." She did not remind him of his cruel words. She did not seek revenge or demand an apology beyond the one he had just given with his entire being. Her victory was not in his defeat, but in her own survival, and now, in theirs. She simply went to the hearth, ladled a cup of hot broth from the pot, and handed it to him. "There is food," she said, her voice calm and even. "Eat. You are weak." Later that day, she loaded a sled she had built from pine boughs with her precious resources. Wheels of cheese, pots of butter, sacks of dried roots from her garden, and a precious bundle of firewood. She gave it to Mr. Gable. "Take this back to town," she said, "for the other families. They will need it more than I do." Her grace was a blade that cut away the last of his pride, leaving him utterly humbled. The immediate aftermath of the great blizzard was a time of reckoning for Providence Gulch. As the survivors dug themselves out, the story of what had happened at the Widow's Hole spread like wildfire. It was told first by a shamed and grateful Mr. Gable, then by his wife, and soon by everyone who tasted the life-saving food that had come from the Fool's Cave. The derisive nickname, the Cave Girl, was retired overnight. No one dared speak it again. If they spoke of her at all, it was with a tone of awe and reverence. They started calling her place the Founder's Hearth, for it felt like the true founding of their community was not in the building of their failed town, but in the survival of this one woman. The relationship between the town and the cliffside dwelling was inverted. The 10-mile journey was no longer a path to a place of mockery, but a pilgrimage to a source of wisdom. People came to trade, offering lumber, tools, and seeds, not for her cheese and butter, but for her knowledge. They asked her advice on how to build, how to insulate, how to prepare. Mr. Gable became her most steadfast ally. His mercantile, the main distributor for Founder's Hearth Creamery products, which he now sold with the reverence of a priest handling sacred relics. Elspeth, in her quiet, unassuming way, shared what she knew. She taught them the principle of thermal mass, showing them how to build their new homes into the sides of hills, using the earth itself as insulation. She showed them how to find and utilize natural chimneys in rock formations, and how to build cisterns that would not freeze. The town of Providence Gulch and the 2 smaller mining camps that it supplied began to rebuild, but this time they built differently. They built smarter. The landscape itself began to change, with new structures hunkering down into the earth, respecting the power of the wilderness instead of defying it. Her own life expanded. With the help of the town, she enlarged her cave home, carefully quarrying out new chambers for a proper dairy and aging rooms. She bought 2 hardy cows, whose rich milk allowed her to make cheeses of a quality and complexity that became famous throughout the territory. Her story traveled with the merchants and trappers, a tale of resilience and ingenuity that inspired settlers in other harsh climates. The woman who had been cast out with nothing had become the bedrock of her entire community. Years later, an older Elspeth would often sit on a smooth stone bench outside the entrance to her home, Boulder's equally old descendant sleeping at her feet. She would look out over the valley, at the town of Providence Gulch nestled below, its rooftops and chimneys now integrated with the land, not just sitting upon it. She felt no bitterness for the past, no lingering triumph over those who had wronged her. The injustice that had set her on this path had been the catalyst, but it did not define her. Her life was defined by the calluses on her hands, the scent of aging cheese in the cool stone rooms, the lowing of her cows at dusk, and the deep, abiding peace of a life built, not bought. She had been given a worthless hole in a rock. She had listened to its secrets, and with her own 2 hands had transformed it into a home, a legacy, and the salvation of a people who had once seen her as nothing. She had built her life not from what the world had given her, but from what it had discarded.